next speaker. Our next speaker is Lindsey Price Jackson. Again, Lindsey is a senior program manager in training and technical assistance team at the Center for Justice and Innovation. With this team, she trains and consults with jurisdiction nationally and internationally as they implement community justice initiative. Before joining the center, Jackson conducted research consulting projects with United Nations, universities, Delta 8.7 project on human trafficking, with Arnold's Venture Pretrial Justice Initiative on prosecutorial discretion and on reform prosecution nationwide, and with Vera Institute of Justice. Jackson began her career as a public defender at the Defender Association of Philadelphia, including volunteering in the problem-solving project Dawn Court for Women with criminal histories of drug and prostitution offenses. Jackson holds a law degree from the Penn State University, and a Master of Public Administration from New York University. Thank you, Lindsey. Please jump in. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. And I also would just like to introduce my colleague who's here with me, Catherine Ford. She's actually going to start us off. So Catherine, maybe you'll take a minute to share a little about yourself and get our slide deck going.
Yes, hi, and good morning, everyone. Thanks, Lindsey. I will go ahead and share screen, and then you can see a little bit more about us. Hopefully that's working.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Okay, excellent. Thank you for that kind introduction. So Lindsey and I both work at the Center for Justice Innovation. We're a large justice reform nonprofit based in New York City, although we also have operating programs in upstate New York and in New Jersey and now in Los Angeles. And we do a variety of things, including research. We have over 60 operating programs in those areas where we implement and evaluate innovative justice practices. And Lindsey and I today are primarily representing the center's technical assistance teams. So I'm a part of the Gender and Family Justice team and the Tribal Justice Exchange teams at the center, providing national training and technical assistance primarily on violence and victimization issues, including trauma-informed practices. And as well, for 9 years, I was a trauma therapist for children and teens at one of the center's small operating programs, which is called Bronx Child Trauma Support. So I'll be speaking from all of those experiences today. And I know Lindsey will be speaking from the diversity of her personal and professional experiences as well. So thank you again for having us. Just to give you a little overview of what we'll be talking about today, we only have 40 minutes and we have a lot to cover, a very, very big topic. So this will really just be kind of an introduction or maybe a review for some of you who've already had some training on trauma and trauma-informed practices. But we'll start by talking about what is trauma, what are the ways it can affect us as human beings, having those types of experiences. Then talking about why we should consider trauma in courts, particularly in treatment court settings. And then we will be providing some specific suggestions for practices that can be used in the courtroom that are trauma informed, that take into account the fact that the majority of your litigants will have had traumatic experiences that may be affecting them. And so how can we support them? How can we identify that and provide supportive resources? How can we minimize the chances that we will cause additional harm or distress for them? All right, so defining trauma, there's many different definitions available out there. The one that we use here is the one from the American Psychiatric Association, DSM, but you'll hear the word trauma being used both to describe the actual experience, which we define as an experience involving the threat of or actual serious physical injury, death, and or sexual violence. And we'll talk in a moment about some examples of potentially traumatic experiences, but trauma can also be used to describe the impacts of those experiences, the responses that we have psychologically and physiologically. And again, we'll be talking much more about what that can look like. And these are experiences that, of course, because of the threat, the serious nature of the threat, they can invoke very intense fear, a sense of helplessness, horror, loss of control, disgust even, and they often overwhelm our capacity to cope because they're really experiences that are outside the realm of usual human experience. And so we'll talk more about this, but the fact that the trauma reactions or symptoms that folks may have are actually completely normal reactions and responses to experiences that are actually abnormal. And you all have probably heard this phrase before, fight, flight, or freeze. But again, because of the threatening nature of these experiences, our brains and our bodies are wired to respond in a way that is most protective for us, that helps us to survive both physically and psychologically that experience. So that could be fighting off the threat, it could be fleeing or running away, or it could be freezing. And so a metaphor I like to give is, imagine if you were like a cave person and you came back to your cave and you saw a huge bear in your cave roaring at you. What are the different things that might happen in your body and in your brain to protect you in that moment? You might fight the bear, you might run away, or you might play dead, which is like freezing. And these are things that we are kind of evolutionarily wired to do in order to protect ourselves, to survive. But the difficulty, as we'll see, is that these responses that can be very helpful in the moment and adaptive can actually cause us a lot of pain and distress when they continue after the threat has passed. So some types of traumatic experiences. Trauma, the concept of psychological trauma was first identified among military personnel. It was called shell shock at the time. And certainly that is a source of traumatic experiences for many folks. We also know that sexual violence can be tremendously traumatizing, and actually among people who've experienced rape, they have among the highest rates of PTSD as opposed to other types of traumatic experiences. But we can also be traumatized by physical violence, physical assaults, of course, the violent death of a loved one, like via homicide or suicide or an accident, serious natural disasters, serious accidents and illnesses. And I should note that we can be traumatized, of course, by these things happening directly to us, but also by witnessing these things happening to someone else, and even through hearing detailed stories about traumatic experiences happening to someone else, which could be a loved one, someone in our personal life, or it could be through our work. So vicarious trauma is another topic that we don't have much time to get to today, but we can actually be traumatized ourselves as workers by hearing about and being exposed to detailed accounts of traumatic experiences of litigants or of clients. I do want to mention as well that historical and intergenerational trauma can play a very significant role. I know you all are in Canada, and so you're probably very familiar with the history of genocide against First Nations people in Canada and Native American people in the United States. So that's an example of the ways that kind of the traumatization of both individuals and communities and peoples, the effects of that can actually be passed down throughout generations. So just some examples, some statistics related to traumatic experiences in the US. I'm guessing most of these are somewhat similar to Canada, but it really to give a sense of kind of how common these types of experiences are. And these are general population statistics. So, and you can imagine as well that it's very difficult to get accurate statistics on some of these, for example, sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, because there's many reasons why folks may not disclose or reach out to help, which we'll talk more about in a bit. And many of these things do happen behind closed doors. So the statistics are always a little difficult to come by, but these are our best estimates, which is about 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 7 boys experience sexual abuse. About 1 in 4 women experience intimate partner violence, and about 10 to 20% of children are exposed to intimate partner violence. About 17% of adult women experience sexual assault. As I mentioned, one difference for Canada. So this statistic, about 22% of teens witness a shooting. My guess is that that's much lower in Canada, which is obviously a very good thing. Because you all know that the US has a very serious gun violence problem, and that relates to this homicide statistic as well. and folks being left behind by homicides. But I think everywhere there are probably high rates of polyvictimization. And what that means is that often folks are not experiencing just one incident of trauma or one type of trauma. They may be experiencing chronic trauma over different stages of their life, and often different types of traumatic experiences. So even when I was working with children and teens, a child may be 10 years old, they may be referred for example, for having experienced sexual abuse, and then we're kind of screening and assessing for other types of traumatic experiences, and they've also exposed to intimate partner violence, and or they were also exposed to community violence. So unfortunately, it's common to have multiple traumatic experiences. And in terms of the criminal legal system, again, these statistics are from the US, but they're probably pretty similar to Canada. But we do know from a lot of research at this point that the rate of traumatic experiences and PTSD is very, very high among criminal defendants, and would be especially high in treatment court settings. We'll talk in a moment about the relationship between trauma and substance use. But we estimate that it's about twice as common in terms of traumatic experience among defendants. Including among youth, very, very high rates of traumatic experiences, and extremely high for women, to the point where I would recommend for all female defendants, essentially assuming that they've experienced violence or victimization, especially sexual abuse. There's a phenomenon called the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, even for women. So extremely common. And then in the treatment court setting, we had a little difficulty finding statistics specific to treatment court, but Lindsey did find one study from one drug court that found that 94% of treatment court litigants had reported at least one traumatic experience. So again, extremely common among the folks that you're working with. And so why consider trauma? Why are we even having this conversation today? There are clearly very significant effects on folks' mental health as well as their physical health. It does contribute to and can comprise a dynamic in someone's substance use. It can play a role in the current violence and abuse that someone may be causing harm to others through violence or abuse, and their own traumatic experiences may play a role in that. Or they may be experiencing violence or abuse currently. And also trauma really influences how folks interact with us, how they interact with us individually as practitioners, with the services that we're providing, with the legal system generally. And as I alluded to a moment ago, trauma also impacts how we respond to them. So some folks who are very traumatized may have very challenging behaviors, right? And they may trigger strong responses in us. But as I mentioned a moment ago, we can also be traumatized by being exposed to their trauma. So there's a lot of kind of interactions and variables that are at play that are trauma related in terms of kind of our work with folks. So I'm going to turn it over to Lindsey now.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks so much. So as Catherine has really been discussing, trauma, of course, has effects on the mind and one's mental health, but it can also have lingering effects on one's physical health and overall well-being. One way that both the brain and body can be involved is demonstrated by PTSD, especially well. So we'll go to the next slide, Catherine. So PTSD is a mental health diagnosis with several criteria, per the DSM, which is that after either directly or indirectly experiencing a traumatic event that a person, one, has intrusive thoughts or memories, including thoughts of violence, perhaps, that seem to just pop out of nowhere. Number two, actively avoiding people or places or even just conversations, right, related to the traumatic event. Number three, changes in thoughts or mood. Examples of this can be disinterest in significant activities, feeling detached from others, persistent fear or anger. And then the last criteria is that someone may experience or does experience changes in their reactions, even things like automatic reactions, right? So think concentration or sleep issues, hypervigilance, think like just not being able to relax, right? You're always alert in a very extreme kind of way. So note how these are intense emotional symptoms, but with a lot of physical manifestations. So go to the next slide. Here are some examples of how PTSD symptoms may manifest in daily life. one consistent theme you'll note among court participants that we may see is our generally punitive criminal court system, right? Settings tend to lend themselves towards power struggles. So if you as a court practitioner are feeling like a conflict power struggle with a participant, you really, the first thought should be, this is a trauma manifestation, not this is an annoying, difficult person who just doesn't want to listen. Next slide. So here's where I really want to share some firsthand experiences. It's one thing and a really good thing to talk about trauma and PTSD in terms of definitions and generalities as we've been doing, but I'm going to share what it's looked like for me as a person living with PTSD and also what I saw in court as a practitioner, recognizing others struggling with trauma and PTSD symptoms in court. I'm a lawyer, I'm a parent, right? I'm a technical assistance provider, but like so many people, including I'm sure many people on this call, I've also experienced trauma, and that trauma ultimately for me culminated in a diagnosis of PTSD. So I'll just share a little bit about that. My first symptoms were very physical, right? I grew up in Anaheim, California. That's where Disneyland is, right? If you've never been to Disneyland, they do fireworks all the time, every night. They're great. They're fabulous. I love fireworks, and every fireworks show I see anywhere else, I'm always like ranking it compared to Disneyland fireworks, right? But one, 4th of July, that's the US Independence Day. We love shooting off fireworks in the US. I was an adult, and although I wasn't feeling any fear watching fireworks, which I totally love, I physically could not keep my eyes open during the fireworks show. And when each like blast went off, my eyes would just pinch shut, my body would shudder. I physically could feel myself closing in, even though I'm like, I love fireworks. What is this about, right? At the time, I really had no idea what was going on. Now I know this as what's called an exaggerated startle response, that things just elicit a huge like almost cartoon reaction to seemingly normal day experiences. So go to the next slide, Catherine. Well, before we do that, actually go back. So I'm one, I'll just share a little bit more. I'm one for whom sudden noises, think fireworks, right? Can be a trigger to my trauma responses. And I remember once sitting of all places in church, right? Hearing a baby in several rows, not right by me, several rows behind me, crying. And my initial thoughts were of violence. And I'm a pacifist. So it's really shocking, thoughts out of your character, that's not you, that's intruding into your thoughts, right? So over time, while I was most symptomatic, I could feel myself kind of changing from extrovert to introvert, right? As far as personality change. And when any little surprise or change in schedule would happen, I overwhelmingly just felt angry, even if it was no big deal, right? So if someone like me, when I was at my most symptomatic, was sitting in court, and the court crier, without warning, suddenly shouts, "All rise," very loud right in my ear. I would have been stressed and even angry at that person, right? And if I didn't understand things in the court proceedings, and things weren't going the way I had imagined, any little change, even if it's an okay change, I would have been stressed and probably angry, right? And I would not be inclined to ask for help in those situations, but I would be inclined to really close in on myself and potentially seek comfort from negative sources, right? So the importance of being aware and empathetic of this in your practice really, to me, cannot be overstated. As a defense attorney in criminal court, drug court, human trafficking court, and so forth, I saw people tense up and react in seemingly, inappropriate ways, non-normal, right? As their trauma responses really bubbled up in those stressful situations, taking forms of anger, appearing overly demanding, right? Or being very impatient, But really, these were very real self-defense mechanisms that I was witnessing, and that I'm sure, all witness more regularly than we think. And these responses are kicking in because a person truly is losing control, right? Losing control of their situation, or maybe even their physical bodies and their liberties, which frankly is like a worse nightmare scenario for people who have PTSD. All right, now let's go to the next slide. So I want to think through sort of a concrete, made up, but concrete example. Let's say we have a case participant. You can see on the slide who's an African-American male. He's pretty young, 30 years old. He did experience sexual abuse as a child, and he does have substance use disorder since he was a teen, since he was young, that he's never told his probation officer about or his case manager about. He was recently arrested on some low-level charge, perhaps related to, the substance use disorder. Probation sees him as uncooperative, keeps using drugs, won't listen, got another charge, no good, right? And so, of course, he's in court for a technical violation on that, because probation's insisting that this is just a bad apple who won't listen. So with the relational aspect of trauma and PTSD, it can be really hard to trust someone, especially someone like a probation officer in that authority figure related to the court, right? And to trust someone enough to disclose something like your history of sex abuse and your substance use. Perhaps let's think about how substance use may be a coping mechanism, right, for this person, or may have started as a young person as self-medicating, or started because they were not being, they were perhaps being neglected, not watched too closely at home. With all the potential courtroom triggers that I've just discussed, how can you imagine court feels for this person? Right. And most importantly, how can you help? What policies can you implement to alleviate or remove trauma triggers from your court? Think about this as an individual and as a team, and we'll have some suggestions at the end of the presentation. So go ahead to the next slide. I'll be quick. Here are a few more ways that trauma can show up in the lives of the people we serve. All right, next slide. Sorry, we have to be fast. As in our case study, let's be explicit about connecting the dots, right, between trauma and substance use, which can go together and unfortunately exacerbate one another, as outlined in these points here on this slide. Note that particularly among women, as Catherine was talking about, the overwhelming majority of females with addiction have experienced trauma in their lives. All right, we'll go to the next slide. Okay, and the last thing I'll say before turning it back to my colleague, I think it's the one before, Catherine, is that trauma also has the unfortunate effect of creating barriers to getting help. People feel stigmatized or ashamed. They avoid talking about the issue. They distrust providers, like we said. And because they're often labeled as difficult, professionals may not bother to take the time to ask them if they need help. So I'll turn it to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Lindsay. That's a great segue into our next portion, where I'm just going to talk a little bit more about some of the potential relationships between trauma and criminality, and I'm putting that in quotes, right, in terms of someone being kind of involved with the criminal legal system. So Lindsay already mentioned that, of course, like there may be substance use related crimes for which someone is arrested that relate to their substance use disorder, which may be related to underlying trauma, right? It may be self-medication. It may be a very entrenched kind of coping mechanism in terms of numbing and trauma avoidance that really helps someone to feel better in the moment, but of course can cause more long-term harms. We also know that folks who have substance use disorders may be involved with prostitution. They may be sexually exploited or trafficked. Again, there's a very strong relationship between childhood sexual abuse and prostitution and sex trafficking, and of course, relationships between those and substance use disorders. As Lindsay was talking about, someone who has PTSD may experience a lot of emotional dysregulation. They may experience angry outbursts. They may be very hypervigilant to threat. And basically what hypervigilance is that feeling that you can never relax, relax. You're always looking over your shoulder. You're always thinking like, this person could be dangerous. This situation could be dangerous. This place could be dangerous, right? So you can never it's very difficult to just trust somebody and relax. But the difficulty there is that your brain is kind of wired to see threat everywhere. So even things that aren't actually threatening may be misperceived as threatening. So even like walking down the hallway and someone accidentally bumps your shoulder and then you punch them in the face because your brain is perceiving that as threatening. So that's something that we see sometimes as well. People who are traumatized will say, oh, somebody touched me and then I just like blacked out. And then there can be coerced or forced criminal activity, which can be present, of course, in trafficking, also in intimate partner violence. There can be an overreaction to perceived threats related to the hypervigilance, but also because of being triggered by kind of a loss of control, even like being told what to do, having to follow a lot of rules. And you know that in court, there's a lot of rules. So even that kind of loss of control or being told what to do can be a trauma reminder for someone who has experienced abuse. Folks may reenact the trauma. Lindsey mentioned kind of getting into power struggles, identifying with the aggressor because the aggressor in a situation is the one that was more powerful and that was safer, right? So maybe I'm like kind of mimicking some of those behaviors that I have learned from being exposed to abuse. And then the response to the system and us, how does trauma play a role in that? We've alluded to some of these things, but Lindsey talked about trauma avoidance. And because the trauma symptoms are so painful and overwhelming and upsetting, people do everything that they can to not think about it, to not be reminded of it. And that includes refusing to talk about certain topics, denying or minimizing the trauma because it's just too difficult or scary or upsetting to think about it, or they just don't trust us, and often for good reason. If you've been hurt by human beings, it's going to be really hard to trust human beings. They may be triggered or upset or reminded of the traumatic experience by certain reminders in the environment, in the court environment, some of which we can predict, right? Like Lindsey talked about sudden loud noises or movements or being touched. But sometimes there's trauma reminders that we don't know about, that we can't know about. It could be like the color of shirt that you're wearing reminds you of something, or the sound of your voice, or a particular word that you use. It could really be anything that reminds the person of the traumatic experience. Folks may be non-compliant, again in quotes, with treatment. They may relapse a lot. They may stop using and then go back to using, especially if their treatment provider is not screening for addressing underlying trauma. It can be completely terrifying actually to go to treatment and to stop using when you have PTSD, because then it can feel like there's no way to numb yourself from the trauma memories, from the trauma symptoms. And we talked about the power struggles already. So really the key question for trauma survivors, this may be a question they're aware of or a question that they are unaware of, but is really, again, about a survival instinct, is what can I do to survive, physically survive and psychologically survive, and have some sense of control, again, when control has been completely taken from me during the traumatic experience, in this world that I'm perceiving as terrifying, violent, and unpredictable. So again, when we're thinking about kind of the symptoms and the behaviors in that way, it actually makes sense. So these trauma symptoms are, again, they're attempts to survive physically and psychologically, to protect ourselves from ongoing harm. They're adaptations. Again, they work. That's why they become very entrenched. Some of these symptoms and behaviors, someone may have had them for 30 years, 40 years, right? Because at the time, they help them survive. They help them feel better. So they can become very entrenched. And again, the symptoms appear logical. They make sense once we know the trauma history that the person has experienced, right? Sometimes we as providers can have an aha moment, like, that's why you do all those things that drive me crazy, right? It's not the person actually, being difficult. Lindsey mentioned that sometimes these folks who are very traumatized, they kind of get a bad rap because they can be very challenging for us to work with. But again, once we learn about the trauma history, it actually makes sense. So what happens if let me just make sure this is me, I think it is. What happens if we miss trauma? We really miss the boat, because often it's trauma that's driving someone's substance use disorder, that may be underlying their mental health issues, that may be really underlying their criminal legal system involvement. And so if we're not addressing the trauma, folks can just keep cycling in and out of the system. And these are the folks that we see who have 40 arrests, right? And nothing seems to work or stick or take. We can also inadvertently trigger folks and even re-victimize them through our legal system processes. We misdiagnose folks, we mistreat them. So we're giving them diagnoses that are actually not accurate. We may be giving them treatments that are not only ineffective, but that can actually be harmful to them, which is a big issue, that some folks who are very traumatized may be diagnosed with other things, oppositional defiant disorder, bipolar disorder, ADHD, et cetera, and not with PTSD. And again, we're missing an opportunity to get folks the help they need and to prevent additional violence, to interrupt that cycle of violence and to stop the revolving doors of the system. So what are some of the trauma-informed responses that we want to recommend? So these are kind of general principles, I'd say. We could talk about each of these much more, but a really, really important first one is just thinking about training for staff, really everyone that interacts with litigants. So not just judges, not just attorneys, but everybody, including court security, including like a front desk person, right? Because all of these folks play a role in how the person is experiencing and interacting with the criminal legal system. And any of them could be inadvertently triggering and or could be supportive, right? Could help somebody feel a little bit safer, a little more in control. So really training and kind of being able to view folks who are traumatized and their behaviors from a different lens with a different kind of philosophy or approach is really, really critical to all of this. Screening and assessment, and this looks differently depending on your role and your setting, but there's two types of screening and assessment really. So one is screening for potentially traumatic experiences, and there are tools for that. Like there's one called the Trauma History Questionnaire, but then also screening and assessment for PTSD. So there's other tools for that purpose, such as the PTSD checklist, the PCL. And depending on your setting, again, and your role, some of these different tools may be appropriate. There's also very brief screening tools available online. At the US Veterans Affairs Administration, they have a really brief screener. It's literally like 3 questions, which can be a really good starting point. And then we really want to focus on creating a comfortable and empowering environment and relationships with folks to the extent possible, again, within our role. But it's really important for folks to feel as physically and psychologically safe as possible. That requires kind of partnering with folks kind of as a team, offering opportunities for choice and decision-making, helping folks understand what's happening in the criminal legal system. Lindsey mentioned that kind of the more that we're overwhelmed and confused about what's happening, the more stressful and potentially triggering it's going to be, again, from that kind of that sense of loss of control. Connecting people with victim services and other trauma care, including trauma-informed, trauma-specific mental health and substance use treatment is very, very, very important. And I think something that treatment courts can really make a lot of difference around in terms of actually assessing the degree to which the treatment providers that you're referring to are trauma-informed and are addressing trauma, because again, if trauma is not addressed, the treatment's unlikely to be successful. And so speaking of incorporating trauma issues into treatment, there's a lot of different ways to do that, which we don't have time to cover today. But again, these are really important questions to ask as a treatment court team of your treatment providers. And really, the last thing I'll say is I just really appreciate this quote. This was from a woman, Tanya Kane, who really, her life experience was reflective of a lot of these dynamics. She had been sexually abused as a child, and she had like 30 arrests for low-level stuff, you know, violations and misdemeanors, prostitution-related offenses, you know, drug possession, et cetera, really cycling in and out of the system. And it wasn't until a substance use treatment provider actually asked about trauma and addressed her trauma that she was able to get effective treatment for her substance use disorder. And now she actually is a speaker for the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. And she really talks about how the goal of trauma-informed practice is to really move our systems and our responses from this kind of reflexive, what's wrong with you? Like, what's up? You know, again, labeling folks as like, oh, they're so difficult, they're a bad egg, right? They're so challenging, you know, so moving from that, and the system again is set up to be punitive in nature, shifting the system from that kind of reflexive response to a response of what happened to you, right? Thinking about what is, you know, what are the potentially traumatic experiences that are leading to your involvement with the criminal legal system. And that really help us to kind of empathically connect with you and understand what's going on and what's underlying your behaviors and how we can best support you and help you heal. So turning it back over to Lindsey to take us home.
Sure. Yeah, I'll finish us out with a few more strategies for practitioners. So look at these here on the screen. When someone is experiencing distress, how can we help them? Grounding, right? We can help bring their focus back to the moment, back to the present, rather than what crazy, scary thing might maybe happen down the line. We can take them aside and offer to do, even though you might feel weird doing it, 3 deep belly breaths with them together. I use this on my toddler, so multiple applications. Okay. We can guide them to push negative thoughts away, right? In meditation, if you're familiar, people are sometimes encouraged to think of unwanted thoughts like leaves gently blowing away. You can kind of use that visual with folks, if it makes sense. And we can encourage people to give themselves a positive pep talk. You know, most of us do this all the time. All right, you can do it. You can do it. I always talk to myself the way that my 7th grade coach said, okay, Price, you could do this. You know? So how can you offer choice, right? Because control is a major issue. How can you offer choice and impart a sense of control to case participants? That's something we'd love you to think about. How can you communicate a spirit of partnership? And how might you maximize predictability for participants? All right, next slide. Just a few more on the screen for you to look at. Has your court applied any of the following practices? Think through that and check all that apply, you know, kind of in your mind, and write down the ones perhaps that you might want to work on or bring to your next team meeting. Next slide. Here's the list continued. I'll let you read through them.
And I'll just say that you'll see that these practices really reflect a lot of what we've been talking about, right? In terms of empowerment, offering opportunities for choice, thinking about the sensory experience of trauma, like minimizing distressing sensory experiences, minimizing physical contact or touch, providing a safe, you know, a calming space in the courthouse, incorporating mental health support on site. All of these kind of things can be very helpful.
Thanks, Catherine. And then I'll just show a few additional resources. These are 3 organizations you might want to look towards if you want to learn more online.
Yeah, and I'll just say that the second one, although it says domestic violence, is actually general to trauma-informed practice, and they have some really, really wonderful resources online, even just like fact sheets, like 1 or 2 page tools for like how to create like a trauma-informed space, a trauma-informed environment, how to like create a sense of emotional and psychological safety in your work. So that I really recommend their website because they have a lot of very, very useful and practical tools for practitioners.
Perfect. And we really appreciate having the chance to speak with you today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I think we have 3 minutes for any questions. But I do want to encourage everyone as well. You'll see our email addresses on the slide, and we'd be happy to hear from you anytime. We're happy to provide more resources by email or talk through some of the issues that you're working through related to trauma-informed practice in your treatment court. So please don't hesitate to use us as a resource as well. Are there any questions?
I don't see any in the question here. I don't see any hands raised. But before we end, Catherine, I owe you a big apology. I did see your description, but much later after I read. So just quickly wanted to kind of talk a little bit about Catherine. Catherine is a licensed social worker, provides training, technical assistance to the state tribal justice system, practitioners nationally through both the Tribal Justice Exchange and the Gender and Family Justice team. In addition, as the center's director of the clinical supervision, Catherine coordinates agency-wide clinical practice initiative, and the center's direct practice staff have access to the clinical supervision and training. By the way, Catherine holds 2 masters, one in, of course, social work from Columbia University, and the other one is public health at John Hopkins University. My apologies to you, Catherine, but Lindsey, Catherine, amazing presentation. I think while you were doing the presentation, it reminded me of trauma. Trauma has become such a huge, big concept that I think connects the micro with the macro and micro. It connects our structures, right? We talk about historical trauma, the trauma of indigenous. We talk about the trauma, of incidents. We talk about the adverse childhood experiences. I think a lot of times, some of the stuff that I know about trauma is that trauma is almost like a chameleon. It can appear like depression. It can appear like ADHD. It can appear like psychosis. It has so many different shapes and forms that trauma can take. And I think part of our challenge as practitioner is what's happening, as I think Lindsey and Catherine very clearly stated, what's happening with this person, I have no idea, right? Unless you know what the trauma is, unless you ask the right question, as I think very eloquently stated, what's not what's wrong with you, but rather than what happened to you. I think amazing. Thank you for this presentation. I'm having a great time. I don't know about you.